Greetings and welcome to the first episode of the Temple of Grief for the new year. And I decided that for this time I wanted to sort of treat it like kind of a fireside chat, if you will. And what I'm calling this one is In the Cocoon at the Start of the New Year. And if you've been following what I've been doing, this is sort of a combination of the My Journey podcast and the Temple of Grief podcast, because I'm going to be talking a bit about what it means to be in the cocoon, which is sort of where I am in this spiritual journey, spiritual process. And there's a couple of books that have been really guiding me through this, and that is, I think I might have even talked about these last week. This one is, they're both by Bill Plotkin. And Bill Plotkin works in what we might call eco-psychology. And so he has a book called Soulcraft, and then he has a book called The Journey of Soul Initiation. And what he does in his work is it takes people on these kind of wilderness, outdoor, healing sort of, healing/holing. Because when we talk about healing, what we're really talking about is becoming whole. Becoming whole is the state of being accepting of all parts of ourselves, the state of being sort of compassionately present in our lives in all capacities. So it's a journey, right? It's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that we necessarily can do very quickly in our lives. It's something that requires, it's like an ongoing practice. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, because I often do fire ceremonies in these podcasts, we burn something in the candle, we burn something in the fire. And in his book, Soulcraft, I think I might even want to read you this passage. He talks about when we come to the fire for transformation. I've been taught in a variety of scenarios, not just in the shamanic training, but that the fire is where we take things that we want to release, right? We want to let go of something. And so we put it into the fire, metaphorically, symbolically, through a gesture, an act, a ceremonial act, where we imbue the thought and the intention and the power into an object, and then we burn that object in the fire. And the fire is an element that is the most potent for causing rapid transformation. There are other ways of transforming, the earth, water, but fire is the quickest. And I think for most of my adult life, as a dabbling Wiccan and as a shaman and as a whatever you want to call me, I think that in my mind it was always about letting go of the things that we don't want. And mostly we usually say letting go of the things that no longer serve us. But in my mind, I think I had constantly conceptualized that as, I want to get rid of this. I want to be free of this thing that is bothering me. But actually, Bill Plotkin talks about it when he says, we enact a ceremony in which participants sacrifice to fire an object representing the chapter of life that is ending. This is not their good riddance to a dull or painful life, but rather a reluctant and courageous willingness to separate from a life that, regardless of how unfulfilling it might have been, sheltered them as they grew. True sacrifice is a way to make sacred. It is not a release of a burden. So in that sense, it made me realize, and oftentimes if you're working in the wellness industry, if you're working in psychology, if you're working in any of these kind of like self-development or personal development fields, there is this understanding that our bad habits, our unhealthy habits, they are protecting us. They are doing us a favor in some way. So, like, for example, if I'm a compulsive eater, then compulsive eating is the way of providing me with comfort for some other thing in my life that is not resolved. And so for me, looking back at 2024, and here's the funny thing, a few months ago, maybe it wasn't a few months ago, maybe it was December, maybe it was, as the year was coming to an end, I saw so many people just sort of saying, oh, good riddance 2024. Oh, what an awful year. It was a terrible year. It was a challenging year, blah, 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 blah. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I must be really lucky because mine wasn't that bad. And yet when I looked back on what I went through this year, and I tend to be a pretty, mild demeanored kind of person. I mean, yes, I get dramatic sometimes, but I don't usually let stressors, affect my public persona. But when I look back at things that I endured this year, I'm like, this is a terrible year. And the challenges that I had to face personally and professionally were deeper, I think, than what I faced in 2020, which to me is kind of interesting now that I have all these skills that I developed after having been through that really massive existential life crisis in 2020. I'm surprised that I'm in a similar space, and yet I'm confident that I know how to move through it because I've done it before. And so I asked myself, it's the workaholic part of me that I'm going to have to sacrifice. And if I'm going to do that, then I need to ask, what does my workaholic life offer me that I need to be willing to give up in order to become whole again? And all signs seem to be pointing to busyness. I don't know how many of you have been tuned into that idea that busyness is the sort of status symbol that we want to dismantle, right? There's no glory in being busy just for the sake of being busy. And yet I think many of us were raised that way. And if I look back at the year, I've basically been in crisis management mode since about September. Most people probably didn't really catch that. But if I look clearly at the last year, I would say there were already signs that there was a crisis developing in June. Maybe even earlier, but definitely if I wasn't consciously aware of it in June, then I was deliberately doing things to make myself unaware of what was happening. And so I waited until there was a crisis to act. And so I'm also asking myself, what do I get out of waiting until things are a crisis? Is that what I need in order to ask for help? Do I need to wait for it to get to be a crisis to ask for help? Maybe the lesson is that I need to learn to ask for help sooner when I see things going, oh, it's starting to go south in whatever area that it is. And I was, kind of chatting with a friend a few months ago about how we sometimes think we are happily delusional, that everybody looks at our lives and says, how in the world, you're so delusional that you're living this magical life. Well, yeah, sometimes we want to be delusional. Sometimes we want to not allow how shall I phrase it? The energy that surrounds us in the world that would constantly want to doubt everything that we have the capacity to do, that would want to kind of poo-poo or denigrate or just otherwise discourage or prevent us from reaching our full potential. And that can happen for any number of reasons. Sometimes people just can't say it's possible. Sometimes there's, jealousy or envy involved. Sometimes it's just people are so used to old ways of being that when we're trying to create a new way of being, that old way butts up against the new way. And, there can be tension or conflict or whatever. And sometimes good old reality comes in and is like, you got some shit you need to take care of, right? And it's not going away, and it's not going to magically resolve itself. And so I was looking at that, and I was looking at how do I look back at 2024, my own personal year of 2024, and see what is the wounding underneath? Because again, a lot of these, whether you're in wellness or psychology or whatever, the very key to our potential in life is usually underneath our core wounding. There's this Chiron and Aries figure that is the wounded healer's kind of archetype, that once we understand what that deep core wounding is, then it becomes the gift that we can offer to other people. So I was like, well, what is the wound? And certainly grief for not meeting my own expectations. That definitely came up this year quite a bit. Grief for not having a thriving business by now, right? Like I went into this in 2020 thinking that it was going to be, I might have thought it was going to be easy, but I just didn't realize it was going to get this far and still not see the growth that I had expected. And then I think I mentioned in a recent episode that I tested on this idea of not having ambition for a while. And if I didn't have any ambition, the lifestyle I'm leading would be perfectly fine. It would be perfectly fine for me. I could go about my life having a perfectly adequate experience. And yet the thing that drove me to make choices this year to get myself in the situation I did was based on this idea that it wasn't based on the idea, but I'm realizing in hindsight, it was my ambition to have higher goals and higher aspirations that led me to those choices, even though the happily delusional part of me was not being as cautious and careful as I could to make sure that the pathway to that was stable and secure. And the other thing I have to grieve this year is trusting that the universe was going to provide for me and then feeling cheated by that trust. Even though I'm fine, I have all my needs met, but the choices that I made to invest money that would require additional funds to come after it, I trusted that was going to happen in I don't know what way. I just trusted that there was going to be funds there to pay for it, and there weren't. And so then I ended up in a sticky situation. But here's the thing, and I don't want anyone to worry. I'm fine. Things are fine. Things are improving. Things are fine. So please don't worry about me. I'm very resilient, and I have been resilient in the past, and I will continue to be resilient. But here's the funny thing that I've been sensing. I sort of feel like I'm undercover in the real world right now. And I was asking myself, am I doing this because I've lost touch with real world struggle? And part of that is because over the course of the last 4 years, I would see a lot of my friends still struggling a lot with this or that or the other, or life or career or blah, blah, blah. And I really have been quite fortunate in the last 4 years. There's been really some beautiful, beautiful, magical experiences that I have been so grateful and fortunate to be able to have. But I do sort of feel like, okay, now it's time for me to get back in touch. And I think part of that comes from, there was a couple of months ago where I was having a conversation with someone that I had just met. And she said something along the lines of, oh, wow, thank you. This conversation was so deep. And I sort of jokingly said, oh, come hang out with me all the time. This is where I live. And then I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, oh, that might have come across as a bit arrogant, right? That I live in deep conversation land and other people without even thinking. Other people are just, sometimes you're just too busy with life to have those conversations. We're just too busy doing our things, making things happen that have to happen, to be able to give ourselves space to really ponder the kinds of questions that I am most excited by, and I hope you are excited by them as well. And the funny thing is, so my partner has been saying to me that here in Erie, Pennsylvania, people probably think I'm, some magical being, some unicorn from another planet or something like that, which I just find amusing. And he said that to me again today. He was like, people don't know what to think about you. And I said that because I have 3 jobs now, right? Because as a recovering workaholic, what do you do when you don't know what to do? You get more work. And in all these 3 jobs, I keep getting really positive feedback, right? Like, oh, we're just so grateful you're here. You're so great. You're so wonderful. We're so happy to have you. And part of me is like, are they bullshitting me? Are they really just blowing smoke up my skirt? And then I was telling that to my partner, and he's like, no, I think really they just don't understand how you can have this sort of wide array of skills that allows me to do a lot of different things and just be very good at them. Sorry, I'm turning the page of my outline here. I'm not just rambling. I do have an outline. But this is where I bring it back to, if you have been paying attention to Jungian analysis and you follow, Joseph Campbell and the archetypal journey, the hero's journey, blah, 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 whether or not you buy into it or not, it doesn't really matter. But even if you don't buy into the hero's journey as, a structure for personal development, there are many, many traditions where they say when you finish your initiation, whatever that initiation is, whether it's a soul initiation, whether it's a cultural initiation or whatever, the implication is at the end of that initiation, your task is to come back to your community and bring back the elixir of life, is what they usually refer to it as. Whatever is the metaphorical elixir of life that you have gained from your magical journeys, right? And so this is where I want to go to Bill Plotkin's other book. When he talks about, wrong book. Sorry, this is still in Soulcraft. When we talk about a soul initiation, a soul initiation, I'm just going to flat out read it. A soul initiation is not something to be worn like a badge or a status symbol. It is to be quietly embodied through a life of soulful service. And that was actually one of the things that motivated me to kind of face my reality and say, okay, well, what does the universe need me to do to be of service? And that's how I started getting all these jobs, because I do have the ability to be of service in my community. And that was really what prompted this current job search. And the other thing that he says, and I look at soul initiation as the process by which we learn what our soul's purpose is on this planet. That's what I look at in a kind of a nutshell. And what I call soul's purpose, Bill Plotkin calls soul image. So if you can just imagine that soul image is sort of synonymous with your soul purpose, I'm just going to read this section for you. Each person's soul image is as unique and mysterious as his or her destiny. One person I know, for example, carries within her the image of a sacred chalice from which others may drink. Others have discovered that their gift is to journey through darkness, bearing light, to stand at the edge of the waters and help those who are ready to cross, to bring the power of healing hands to the world, to shine the light of the north, to sing the song that calls the divine beloved, to be for others a glistening web over waters, to mirror the hearts of others, to walk rainbows, to stalk the heart like a wolf, to sing the songs of the soul, to offer the compassion, courage, and wisdom of a strong and nurturing tree, to be the gift of a sparkling heart, or to echo the cry of the earth. Mali Domosome, the African shaman and teacher from the Dagara tribe, learned during his initiation that his gift was to make friends with the stranger or enemy. I think right now, here in the United States, as we are preparing for the transfer of power, I think actually this podcast will drop on the day that power transfers. It's time. It's time for us all to learn what our soul's purpose is. And I imagine there's a lot of folks out there who are going to learn that theirs is a very similar gift as Mali Domosome's, to make friends with the stranger or enemy. And I want to also talk about this idea of when we do come back with the elixir of life. Bill Plotkin talks about that too, and I want to give you just a little snippet of what he says. And now we're in the other book. Okay. Is this what I wanted to say? Returning with the elixir of life? Okay, so what we're doing here, the context to these that he's giving, is when we do the soul initiation, when we do, part of it is shadow work, right? We have to do shadow work. Part of it is looking at our wounding, right? And he even talks in some of his books about how sometimes this work isn't actually therapeutic. Sometimes it's counter-therapeutic. Because in order for us to get underneath whatever the wounding is, sometimes it has to be reopened. So here he says, mature heroes and heroines descend into the shadowy depths, sacrifice who they have been, and offer themselves to the numinous forms and forces of the underworld as raw material to be dismembered and then reconfigured in a way that might enable them to return to their people humbly bearing a never-before-seen gift and contribute to their community's survival, if not its renaissance or evolution. Wow, right? No small task. Just get right on that after your morning coffee. Contribute to their community's survival, if not its renaissance or evolution. That's where we are right now, and that is what I'm feeling called toward, and I hope you are feeling called toward that as well. And the other thing that I think is so important about this work, and people forget that grief is part of the work of being human. And quite often, it's underneath the very grief that we are experiencing that we will find gifts that we can share with others. And I want to also sort of call attention to how important it is and how necessary it is to not ignore or gloss over despair or grief or loss or whatever those things are. Because when we ignore them, when we gloss over them, when we stuff them, they're going to come up later in ways that are generally very unhealthy. So he describes in his book here, one of his clients or participants, someone who was working with him, who was talking about, she actually developed a workshop called From Despair to Empowerment, and then she realized later on that those were the wrong prepositions. It's not about from and to. So she began to call it despair and empowerment, because they exist together. They exist in a complementary fashion. or as she says, they dance together, sort of a yin and yang. And you discover that the despair or the grief, the great grief, also the great anger and fear and the overwhelm, that these enable you to discover what appears to be a tremendous belonging. Something better than you could have imagined. It's better than being optimistic. It also builds trust because you can see people experiencing despair and you don't have to rescue them. You don't have to make them feel better because you know that what they are going through is generative. So I have a few more things I had wanted to talk about today. He goes into some detail about this idea of what it is to be in a cocoon and what it is to make a butterfly out of that nothingness, what it means to shift our consciousness, because when we shift our consciousness, we are also shifting our reality. And he also talks in his book about the phase that I feel I'm very much in, very much wanting to serve. There's a stage in our life where we are ready, willing, and able, and present, and yet we haven't quite developed the systems of delivery of whatever it is that our gift is to the world. And so that is a particular phase in the process too, where he talks about desiring of wanting to serve, and yet not yet being able to serve to our greatest capacity. So I think I'm going to go ahead and just pause there for this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, please include them. I'm happy to respond. And then don't forget that, on this side right here is the link for the virtual tip jar. If you feel inspired and you want to donate a few bucks to help keep this work going, I would be very happy to receive that graciously. So on this day that power is transferring, and that the world is shifting. The world is always shifting. That's the only constant. The world is always shifting. So I invite you to grieve your losses, and I invite you to greet your soul. Have a good one.